So we're going to do a pretty simple finish on this, and before we get started, just a couple of brief words about preparing your piece for a finish. One thing you want to keep in mind is that you really want to prepare all your surfaces the same way. And while hand planing is a great way to avoid sanding, if you can't plane every part of the base, and you have to do any sanding on the base, then you're really going to want to do that same sanding on the flat areas as well. Because if you don't sand, if you only sand parts, what's going to happen if you're using any type of pigment stain or dye is that the parts that you sand are going to tend to absorb more of that dye than the parts that are just planed. And you're going to get color differences, which you really want to avoid. So as painful as it may sound, you're going to want to go ahead and sand the top, sand the aprons, because we went through and we sanded the legs. So I sanded this up through 150. I took just a Tupperware container and a rag with water, wet all the surfaces down, and then after it dried and raised the grain, I sanded everything again with 220, and that's where I stopped my sanding. So then I tacked it all off with just a rag with some denatured alcohol, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dye this piece. And we're going for sort of a dark red mahogany type look, so I'm going to use a water-based dye to dye the poplar. So what I've got here is this is a red mahogany water-based dye from Lockwood that I picked up from Tools for Working Wood. And it comes in a package of dry powder that you just mix with water. I mixed it with about 4 cups of hot water. So I, not quite boiling, but, filled a tea kettle with water and got it hot. 4 cups of water to the 1 package of Lockwood dye to help dissolve all the dye powder. Once everything's dyed, dissolved rather, then I just let everything cool down to room temperature, and now we can go ahead and use it. And I'm just going to use a rag, and this makes an awful mess. So I've got a drop cloth on my bench, I've got gloves on, and we're just going to flood the surface. I really want to just cover everything, with a heavy coat of the dye. And it's fine if it drips. It's not a big deal. This is not like a pigment stain. Dyes tend to absorb much faster than a stain. So I am just going to take this rag soaked in dye, and I'm just going to soak all the different parts of the base. Okay, once we have everything flooded real well, I'm going to go back and just take some paper towels and kind of wipe off all the excess. And I'm going to try and blend the colors here, because you'll notice in end grain areas it's going to tend to absorb a little darker. So I'm going to try and wipe the end grain areas a little more, and I'm going to wipe the long grain areas a little less. And you can already see that there's a few areas where I've got some color differences, because this area had been planed and probably not sanded as well as the legs, and the legs have some end grain. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of work to blend these colors, perhaps adding another coat of dye to the aprons and letting that sit a little bit longer. Or perhaps taking a wet rag and wiping the legs down to try and lighten them up a little bit, pull some of the dye back out of the legs. That's the nice thing about these water-based dyes, is that they don't dry so quick that you have plenty of time to go ahead and play with them and blend them. And you can do a lot of blending of colors and such with nothing more than a wet rag and a little bit of extra dye, just by pulling some of the dye up from some areas and laying it down a little bit heavier in others. Okay, so it's not the prettiest right now, and you might be looking at it thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, what did we do? We took a really nice table and we just ruined it. But we've got to do this finish in stages, and I think as this goes along, you're going to see this start to look better and better. Right now, I've just been trying to even out the color a little bit by wiping a little bit more of the dye. Like I said, you can use a wet rag and pull the dye out of some of the heavier areas and leave it in some of the lighter areas to try and blend those. And there'll be other ways that we can help to blend these colors later if after the next step we're not completely happy. We have other options that we can use to blend these colors a little bit better. But for now, I am going to let this sit for a day or two to let this dye completely dry before we move on to the next step. So the dye dried overnight, and I had a few minor problems that I wasn't expecting. I don't usually dye cabriole legs, and doing this project reminded me why I usually don't. The problem with cabriole legs is that doing all this shaping exposes a lot of end grain. And what that end grain has a tendency to do is pull in, really suck in a lot of that dye, a lot more so than a face grain. So you can see a lot of these areas on these legs are almost black in color. If you come in and you look at that and, oh my goodness, what did I do? I just ruined my whole project. There are a couple ways you can prevent this from happening, and preventing it is probably the easiest way. Of course, I didn't do any of those steps, so now I'm going to have to go ahead and fix it. But to prevent the problem from happening in the first place, there are a couple things you can do. The first is to use a more diluted concentration of the dye on the legs. Maybe do several coats rather than flooding the whole thing with the same dye. That way you may be able to control the absorption of the dye a little bit better on the legs. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Another option is to pre-wet the legs. Take a rag soaked in water and wipe the legs down and get them wet before you put the dye on there. So with those wood fibers saturated with water, they're going to absorb less of that dye. And what dye that they do absorb will be diluted down with the water that's already been absorbed. Another thing you can do is to seal these up with a coat of sanding sealer. So you can take a de-waxed super blonde shellac, or Zinsser makes a product called Seal Coat, which is basically just a very thinned down de-waxed super blonde shellac, and you give the legs a good coat of the sanding sealer first, and then sand them, and then apply the dye. So there's several options that you have, to handle what could happen. Of course, this is what did happen, so now I have to deal with the problem. The nice thing about a water-based dye, though, is that it's water-based. So I can take something as simple as just a balled-up wad of, pretty wet paper towels, and what you'll see if I start working these areas that are really dark, I can pull some of that dye back out. Now you're only going to be able to do so much of this. You're not going to be able to pull all of the dye out to restart. But you can pull a significant amount of that dye off of these legs. And I don't know if the lighting in here is good enough or the camera is sensitive enough to pick it up. But you can see this leg is already starting to get lighter in color. So what I'll do is I'll work around, and I'll especially focus on the really dark areas like the end grain of the knee blocks and the tops of the knees where a lot of that end grain got exposed. And I can wet that down and just sort of wipe away a good portion of that dye. You'll see how much dye this paper towel wad already picked up. So I'm going to work on these for a little while, and I'm going to, just use as many paper towels as it takes. Wet them down, rinse them out if you can, and pull up some of this dye. And I'm going to try and pull these legs to a color that's a little bit closer to what I've got on the aprons. So I was able to pull some of the color out of this and lighten the legs up a little bit, as you can see. The problem is sometimes you get some light spots, and I did my best to try and blend everything in. I even touched a couple of these with a little bit more dye to try and darken them again and blend them back. And I think I'm done messing around with it. I've got it probably as good as I'm going to be able to get it. And again, the solution to this problem would have been either pre-wetting the legs or sealing them with a thin sealer coat of shellac before applying the dye, so that not as much dye got into the end grain areas of the legs. But it's not the greatest dye job in the world, but I think once it ages a little bit and some of the lighter spots, some of the darker spots rather, fade a little bit, I think things will blend a little bit better, and they'll turn out a little better. So to finish this up, to top coat this, I'm going to be using shellac. So what I'm going to use is just what I've done is I've taken a mixture and I've mixed 1:1, 1 part of clear or super blonde shellac, and this is actually pre-mixed shellac in clear, and 1 part denatured alcohol. So with a 1:1 mixture, I just mixed them up, and now I'm going to go ahead and put on several thin coats of shellac, and probably going to end up with anywhere from 8 to 10 coats on here by the time I'm finished, I'm guessing, because the end grain, especially in the knees, the tops of the feet, is really going to soak this shellac up. And in order for it to start building, you've got to get all the pores filled with shellac before the finish will actually start building a thicker layer. So I don't know how many coats it'll take. I'm guessing somewhere around 8 or 10 coats, but it goes on very thin and it dries super fast. So I'll start with this leg here, work my way around the table. By the time I've finished and gotten back, this leg will likely be dry enough to start the second coat. So I'll probably be able to put 5, 6, 7 coats on in a single evening. Letting it dry about 15 minutes between each coat. And like I said, by the time I work my way around the table, get back to the leg I started with, I'll most likely be able to start the second coat. So once I've got 8 to 10 coats, you'll know once you've got the shellac built up to enough thickness, because the wood will no longer absorb, and you'll start to see it get glossier and glossier with each coat. Once you have it where the shellac is drying on the surface and it's really shiny, you'll know that you're done. So after about 6 coats of the shellac, I'm going to take some 320 grit sandpaper and I'm going to start knocking down the dust nibs and the smoothing out and leveling the shellac surface. If you're using the shellac full strength without diluting it with alcohol, you could probably do this after 3 coats, but since I cut mine 1:1 with alcohol to make a thinner shellac, and the coats are going on thinner, I have about 6 coats on here. So I'll take some 320 and go ahead and just start knocking down and smoothing everything out and leveling it all out. And where you want to be careful is around the edges, the corners, because because of the nature of the edge and the corner, it becomes easier to sand through the finish in those areas. So just be careful around corners and edges. So once I have the table sanded through 320 and everything smoothed out, then I'm going to go ahead and put the final coats of shellac on. And depending on how you cut your shellac, again, if you're using it full strength, straight from the can, you'll probably get away with 2 coats. If you cut it with alcohol like I did mine, it'll probably take 3 to 4 more coats to finish this off. Once I have the final coats of shellac done, the final step is to rub out the finish. And you might look at it and think that it's done, but it really helps to do a final rub out of the finish to give it a look that isn't so plastic like. So I start by just taking some 400 grit sandpaper and knocking down the rest of the high spots and beginning to and leveling any remaining high areas, and basically I'm going to end up dulling this finish down, and then we will rub it up and polish it to the desired sheen after we have the final smoothing done and everything rubbed down level and smooth. So I start with 400 grit. So once it's sanded with the 400 and everything's smooth, it's just about uniformly dull. There's a few shiny spots here and there. Now it's time to make a decision. If you want a really shiny, highly polished surface, you can continue to take this up through 600, 1000 grit. You can go and rub it out with pumice and rotten stone. You can use automotive polishing compound and automotive swirl remover as a final step. The thing with a really highly polished surface like that is it's actually more difficult to do because you really need perfectly smooth flat surfaces, because those really glossy shiny surfaces show every minor imperfection. So if you want to do a surface like that, make sure you take plenty of time beforehand, before you dye the piece, to really sand it well, get all the imperfections out, and then you may even want to sand several times between coats of shellac to make sure that your final shellac coat is perfectly smooth and leveled in order to do that high polished surface. I like more of a satin semi-gloss type finish to my pieces. It hides the imperfections a little bit more, and I think it's just more of a casual type finish, and it's more appealing to me. But either way is fine. So I have it finished sanding with the 400. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take some paste wax, some finishing wax, and some 4/0 steel wool, and I'm going to start rubbing this out. And I'm going to rub the wax in, and between the wax and the steel wool, it's going to remove those last scratches, and it's going to give this a nice satin polish. So I'll take a few minutes, rub this wax in with the steel wool, and then once the table is all waxed, I'll give the wax about 10-15 minutes to dry. Probably closer to 5. I'm usually pretty impatient. But 5 or 10 minutes, say, for the wax to dry a little bit, and then take a soft cloth and we'll buff it out to that satin finish. So after I buff it out with the wax and take all the excess wax off with a rag, the last thing I like to do is to take a fresh clean rag, and I'm just using an old bed sheet here, and buff up the surface to the final sheen, and get all the remaining wax dust and things off, and buff it up to that final shine.
all that's left is to attach the top. So I've put an old bed sheet down underneath the top just to protect it from so the workbench doesn't scratch the top up, since the top's already been finished and buffed out. And now I'm just attaching everything through those glue blocks with some brass screws. And we can give it a final wipe down. Take the bed sheet out from under it. And we are done. And I'm pretty pleased with it. I really think the Porringer top came out good, and even after the little setback that I had with the die, I still think the finish came out pretty good. So that's it. The table is now officially done, and I hope you enjoyed watching me build it as much as I enjoyed building it.